Don't you touch her.
The words were low, cut from the same granite as the mountains behind him. You think you know what a man will fight for? His land, his name, the memory of his dead. You're wrong. Sometimes it's for something quieter. It's for the way a woman's hands, patient and sure, can mend a worn shirt by the firelight, stitching back together a life you thought was torn for good. It's for a quiet that has finally returned to a house long given over to the wind. And to understand how Elias Thorne got to that point, a Winchester rifle feeling like a part of his own arm, and everything he had left to lose standing right behind him, you have to go back. You have to go back to the beginning, to the first snow of a winter that would change everything. A winter that would prove the truest shelter is not a roof, but a reason to come in from the storm. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? 9 years. For 9 years, Elias Thorne had mistaken solitude for peace. He had narrowed his life down to the clean, hard lines of work and exhaustion. He owned 300 acres of rock and bunchgrass pressed up against the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, a place that demanded more than it gave. But it was honest in its demands. The land did not lie. It did not make promises it couldn't keep, and it did not die from a fever in the space of 9 days, taking your whole world with it. His wife Sarah and their son, a boy who had only known 3 months of life, were buried under a pair of cottonwoods by the creek. He had chiseled their names into a single river stone himself. Sarah Thorne, Jacob Thorne. He didn't visit the graves. He didn't need to. They were everywhere, in the empty space on the other side of the bed, in the hook by the door where her bonnet used to hang, in the profound, unending silence of the cavern after the sun went down. So he worked. He rose before the sun, his first thought of the cattle, his last of the fence line that needed mending. The work was a penance and a prayer. It scoured his mind clean of memory. Grief had not made him hard, as it did some men. It had made him careful. He was careful with his tools, with his animals, with the few words he spent in town once every 2 months for salt, flour, and coffee. He had simplified his life until there was nothing left that could be taken from him. That was the logic of it. His only human connection of any substance had been Nantan, an Apache man, younger than him by a decade, who had simply appeared one spring and offered to work for a fair wage. Nantan understood the language of silence. He knew the difference between a man who didn't want to talk and a man who couldn't. For 4 years they had worked side by side, sharing a noon meal of jerky and hardtack without needing to fill the space between them with noise. Nantan had a wife and a child in a small settlement 2 days' ride south. He would work for Elias for a season, then return to them, his saddlebags heavy with coin and goods. He was steady. He was honest. He was, Elias admitted in the most private corner of his mind, a friend. 2 months ago, Nantan had been clearing brush near the creek when a rattler struck him high on the calf. A bad bite. Elias had done what he could. The knife, the whiskey, the tourniquet, but the poison was too fast. He had sat with Nantan as the life went out of him, the man's last words a fevered mix of his own tongue and a single, clear English phrase directed at Elias. "The letter," he'd gasped. "My sister." Elias had not understood. He buried Nantan next to his own wife and son under the cottonwoods, adding a third, unmarked pile of stones. The silence of the ranch had returned, deeper and more absolute than before. It was that silence that was broken on a cold morning in late October. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy with the promise of the winter's first real snow. Elias was out by the barn, pitching hay to his small herd, when the sound of a horse's labored breathing reached him. It was not a familiar sound. He moved without thinking, his hand finding the worn stock of the Winchester he always kept leaning just inside the barn door. He stepped out, leveling the rifle, his eyes scanning the grey landscape. A figure on a pinto, horse and rider looking equally spent, was making its way up the long track to his cabin. Even from a distance, he could see it was not a threat he recognized. Not a land agent, not a drifter. As the rider drew closer, he saw it was a woman. An Apache woman. She wore a heavy wool blanket over a hide dress, and her black hair was tied back in a simple knot. She stopped the horse, 20 paces from him, her eyes dark and unreadable, fixed on the rifle in his hands. She did not seem afraid, merely observant. Elias lowered the rifle, but did not put it aside. "This is private land," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. The woman swung her leg over the pinto and slid to the ground. She moved with a fluid grace, despite her obvious exhaustion. She was young, maybe 20. "I am looking for Elias Thorne," she said. Her English was clear, accented, but precise. "You found him?" She nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. "My name is Ison. Nanton was my brother." The name hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, at the high cheekbones and the steady gaze so like her brother's. He saw the grief in her eyes, a quiet, banked fire that mirrored his own. He did not know what to say. "I'm sorry for your loss," he managed. The words felt small and useless. She gave another of those small nods, accepting the sentiment, but not dwelling on it. From a pouch at her belt, she withdrew a folded piece of tanned leather, worn soft with handling. She held it out to him. "He told me to give you this." Elias hesitated, then stepped forward and took it. Inside the leather was a piece of paper, folded and smudged. It was a letter, written in the tidy, looping script of the town clerk in Wilcox, the man who wrote letters for those who could not. He unfolded it. "Elias," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I owe you a debt, not for coin. When my son was sick, you gave me the money for the doctor in Tucson. No questions. You saved him. A life for a life. That is the balance. My sister Ison is a good worker. She is strong. She can mend and cook and knows the way of horses. She will work for you to pay my debt. She has no one else now. Do not send her away. This is my last ask of you. Your friend, Nantan." Elias read the letter twice. A life for a life. He remembered the day well. Nantan had been agitated, speaking of a fever. Elias had given him $60, a fortune, all he had in cash, and told him to ride fast. He had never considered it a debt. He had done it because Nanton was his friend, and his son was sick. The idea that this woman was here to work it off felt wrong, like a transaction over a grave. He looked up from the paper. The first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, fat and wet, melting on the dark wool of her blanket. Her face was impassive. He saw now that her refusal to show fear was not arrogance, it was pride. She was not a beggar. She was here to fulfill an obligation. "There was no debt," Elias said, his voice flat. "My brother said there was," she replied, her chin lifting a fraction. "His word is his bond, so it is mine." He looked at the sky, then at the tired horse, then at her. The snow was coming faster now, The wind was picking up, a low moan through the pines. He could send her away. He could give her some money and point her toward the next town. But the letter,
She has no one else now.
do not send her away. It was the plea of a dying man for the last person he loved. And there was a blizzard coming on. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't send her out into that. It would be a death sentence. He let out a long breath, the air pluming white in front of him. The horse can go in the barn. There's an empty stall. He gestured with the rifle barrel. There's food inside the cabin. The storm will be bad. He did not offer welcome. He offered shelter. It was all he had, and it was all she seemed to expect. She led the pinto toward the barn without another word. Elias watched her go, the letter still in his hand. He felt the careful, simple lines of his life begin to blur. The silence he had cultivated for 9 years was not broken. It had been occupied. The first day, the blizzard trapped them. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin and the white fury outside. Elias gave her the small cot in the corner, the one he'd built for a child who never got to use it. He took his bedroll by the fire. They moved around each other in the cramped space with a wary, animal grace. She did not ask for anything. She observed. When he went to fetch water, she had the fire stoked and burning hot by the time he returned. When he started to patch a tear in his canvas coat, she took the needle and thread from him without a word and did it herself, her stitches small and even, a perfect, near-invisible seam. He watched her hands. They were never idle. She had a small bundle of her own things, and from it she took dried herbs and roots. She would grind them with a smooth stone, her movements economical and practiced. The cabin began to fill with the unfamiliar, pleasant smells of juniper and sage. It was the first time in 9 years the house had smelled of anything other than wood smoke, coffee, and solitude. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the unspoken. He felt her eyes on him sometimes as he cleaned his rifle or checked the new snowshoes he was making. It was not a challenging gaze, but a measuring one. He found himself doing the same. He noted the way she stood, balanced and centered, as if she were always ready to move. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the way she understood the function of a tool just by watching him use it once. She was, as her brother had promised, a worker. She looked for it, saw what needed to be done, and did it. On the 3rd day of the storm, he woke to the smell of fresh bread. She had found his meager supply of flour and yeast, and while he slept, had baked a small, perfect loaf on the hearthstone. He sat at the small table, and she placed a piece of it, still warm, in front of him. He ate it. It was the best bread he'd had in a decade. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, her eyes on the fire. It was the first crack in the ice. A small thing, but it was a start. He found himself talking, not to her directly, but to the room. "The snow will last another day, maybe 2, he said, looking out the single window. "The north drift will be over the fence line by the barn. We'll have to dig the cattle out." She listened, her expression unchanging. "I have dug through snow," she said simply. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, a piece of her history, offered up like a handshake. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the world was white and silent, the sun a pale disk in a frozen sky. Just as he'd predicted, a massive drift had buried the corral fence and blocked the barn door. He grabbed a shovel. When he turned, she was there, holding the other one, wrapped in her heavy blanket, her breath misting in the frigid air. They worked all day, shoulder to shoulder, in a steady, powerful rhythm. He was a strong man, used to hard labor, but he was stunned by her endurance. She never slowed, never complained. The cold was brutal, a physical force that stole the breath and numbed the bone. But she seemed almost impervious to it, her focus entirely on the task. They dug out the cattle, who were huddled and miserable but alive. They cleared a path to the well. They repaired the section of fence that had collapsed under the weight of the snow. By the time they were done, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and violet. They were both exhausted, their muscles aching. Back in the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a blessing. She prepared a stew from the last of his salted beef and some of the dried roots she had brought. They ate in their usual silence, but it was different now. It was the quiet of shared labor, of a battle fought and won together. It was no longer the silence of strangers. That evening, as she sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts, he noticed for the first time a thin, silvery scar that cut across the back of her right hand, from her knuckle to her wrist. It was an old wound, long-healed, but stark against her brown skin. Without thinking, he looked at his own left forearm, at the ragged, puckered scar that ran from his elbow to his wrist, a gift from a cornered cougar 6 years before. His was a mark of brute survival. He wondered what story hers told. He did not ask. Some stories were not meant to be told, only recognized. The weeks turned into a month. The initial wariness between them softened into a routine. They worked the ranch together, falling into a partnership that needed few words. She learned his rhythms, and he learned hers. He learned that she was an expert tracker, able to read the story of a day in a set of prints in the snow. She learned that he was a patient teacher, showing her how to set a splint on a calf's broken leg, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He began to see the land through her eyes. One day, they were riding the fence line along the creek. He had always called it Blackwood Creek, the name on his deed and on the territorial maps. She pointed to a particular bend, where the water ran deep and clear over smooth, dark stones. "In my language," she said, her voice soft, "we call this part of the river To-e-hani, water that remembers." "Remembers what?" he asked. She looked at him, her dark eyes serious. "Everything. The snows that feed it, the animals that drink from it, the people who have lived by it. The water does not forget." He thought of Sarah and Jacob, buried just 100 yards away. He had never thought of the creek that way, as a witness. The idea settled in him, strange and comforting. The map name was a label. Her name was a truth. The quiet evenings became less about silence and more about quiet. She would work with her hands, sometimes mending, sometimes weaving intricate patterns into strips of leather with colored thread. He would read from the one book he owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare he had inherited from his father, his voice a low rumble in the small cabin. He wasn't sure if she understood all the words, but she listened with an unnerving stillness. One night, he finished a passage from The Tempest and closed the book. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "My brother," she said, not looking up from her work, "said you were a careful man." Elias was surprised. He hadn't known Nanton saw him that way. "He said that?" "He said grief can make a man hard, or it can make him careful. He said you were made of the second thing, that you paid attention. He said that is why he trusted you." He didn't know how to respond. It felt like a verdict on his soul, delivered by a dead man and his sister. He thought of the 9 years of solitude, of the life he had so meticulously simplified. He had called it being careful. Maybe Nantan was right. But carefulness had also been a cage, a way to keep the world at arm's length. He looked at Ison, her face illuminated by the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration over her task. The cage door felt like it was starting to swing open. He found himself wanting to offer something of his own. "The garden," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Out back. My wife Sarah, she planted it. Roses and corn and squash, she could make anything grow." Ison looked up, her hands still. "It is fallow now." "Yes," he said, "for 9 years." He had not spoken his wife's name aloud in almost that long. Saying it now felt like breaking a fever. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt. He saw a flicker of understanding in Ison's eyes, a shared knowledge of loss that needed no further words. The trust between them was not a thing that was declared. It was built, day by day, in small, honest moments. It was in the way he no longer felt the need to carry his rifle everywhere on the ranch. It was in the way she began to hum softly to herself as she worked, a low, melodic sound that filled the corners of the cabin. It was in the unspoken agreement that they were a team, two solitary people standing against the harshness of the land and the coming winter. He realized one afternoon, watching her calm a spooked horse with a soft murmur and a steady hand, that he no longer thought of her as Nantan's sister. He no longer thought of her as the woman who had appeared at his door. He thought of her as Ison. And he realized, with a jolt that was equal parts fear and something else he couldn't name, that he could not imagine the ranch without her. The silence he had once cherished now felt like a pale imitation of the comfortable quiet they shared. The thought was terrifying. It made him vulnerable again. It gave him something to lose. The second month of winter was harder than the first. The snows were deeper, the cold more relentless. But the work was easier because it was shared. And inside the cabin, a fragile warmth was growing that had nothing to do with the fire. It was Dr. Miller who brought the world crashing back in. He rode out from town in mid-January, his face grim. He was an old friend of Elias's father, and one of the few people Elias still spoke to. "Elias," he said, accepting a cup of coffee and warming his hands by the fire, his eyes flicking curiously toward Ison, who was grinding corn by the hearth. "I came to warn you." "About what?" "Silas Croft." Elias knew the name. Croft was a cattle baron from the next county, a man who had swallowed up 6 smaller ranches in the last few years. He was a man who arranged things, who used lawyers and land deeds like weapons. "What about him?" Elias asked, his body tensing. "He's filed a claim on your water rights," the doctor said, his voice low. "The whole of Blackwood Creek. He's claiming an old surveyor's map from the 1850s shows the creek bed on his original parcel. It's nonsense, a paper trick, but he's got Judge Hemmings in his pocket. He's trying to choke you out, force you to sell for pennies." Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The creek was the lifeblood of his ranch. Without it, his land was worthless. His cattle would die. It was a death sentence delivered on a piece of paper. "He knows I won't sell," Elias said. "That's why he's not asking," Miller replied. "He's taking. Be careful, son. Croft doesn't like to be told no. He'll have the law on his side, or at least the color of it." The doctor left, and the quiet in the cabin felt different. It was heavy now, laced with menace. Ison had stopped her work and was watching him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp, alert. She had heard everything. "This man," she said, "he will come here." "Yes," Elias said, "he will." He spent the next few days in a dark mood, the injustice of it eating at him. He had poured his life, his sweat, his grief into this land. It was his anchor, the one thing that had held him steady when the rest of his world had washed away. The thought of a man like Croft taking it with a lie and a paid-off judge filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. A week later they came. 3 men on fine-looking horses, riding as if they owned the valley. Silas Croft was in the lead, a large man with a soft body and hard eyes. He was flanked by 2 hired men, the kind who wore their guns tied low and looked at the world with a bored sort of contempt. Elias met them on the porch, his Winchester held loosely in his hands, pointing at the ground. He had told Ison to stay inside. "Thorn," Croft said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. He didn't dismount. "I assume you received word of my legal filing. I'm here to serve you the official notice. My men will be assessing the creek for a new dam site." "This is my land, Croft. That creek has been part of this ranch for 50 years, Elias said, his voice level. Croft smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "The law says otherwise. A simple surveying error. Unfortunate for you." He pulled a document from his coat and held it out. "Now, you can be reasonable about this." The cabin door opened. Ison stepped out. She didn't look at Croft or his men. She looked at Elias. In her hands, she held a bow. It was an Apache longbow made of seasoned Osage orange, a powerful, deadly weapon in the right hands. She held it with the casual familiarity of someone who had been born to it. An arrow was nocked, but not drawn. Croft's men, who had been looking on with amusement, suddenly tensed. Their smirks vanished. A white rancher with a rifle was one thing. An Apache woman with a war bow was something else entirely, something unpredictable and dangerous. Croft's eyes narrowed. "Who is this?" "She's with me," Elias said, his voice hardening. "And you're not setting 1 foot near that creek. Your paper is a lie, and you know it. Get off my land." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension was a palpable thing. Croft looked from Elias's cold eyes to Ison's impassive face, to the deadly potential of the bow she held. He was a man who calculated odds. He had expected a beaten-down widower, not a united front. "This is a mistake, Thorn," Croft said, his voice losing its smooth edge. "I will be back, and I'll have Marshal Tibbs with me. We'll see how you stand against a federal warrant." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They kicked their mounts into a gallop and disappeared down the track, leaving a cloud of disturbed snow behind them. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to Ison. She was still watching the riders disappear, her knuckles white where she gripped the bow. "Thank you," he said. She finally looked at him. "They will be back," she stated. "I know." That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever, the world pressing in on them. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name. Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames, Croft's threat echoing in his mind. He knew the marshal was a weak man, easily swayed by money and influence. Croft would get his warrant. They would come back, and they would take everything. He looked at Ison. She was sitting on the cot, sharpening a skinning knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. By staying, she had placed herself in the path of his trouble. Croft had seen her. He would not forget her. Elias could send her away, for her own safety. He could tell her to ride south, back to her people, to leave him to face this alone. It would be the sensible thing to do, the careful thing. But the thought of her leaving, of this house returning to its empty silence, was more terrifying than Silas Croft and his hired guns. He had rebuilt his life on the foundation of having nothing to lose. It had been a lie. He had everything to lose, and she was sitting right there, the quiet center of his world. Nanton had sent her here for shelter, and Elias had brought a storm down on her head. He had to find a way to protect her, to protect them. The truest shelter is not a roof, but a reason to come in from the storm. The phrase, his own invention, came back to him. She was his reason. He thought about the law, the paper tricks Croft used. Law could be a weapon, but it could also be a shield. An idea began to form in his mind, desperate and radical. It was a long shot, a gamble on a legal technicality and the deeply ingrained prejudices of the territory. He stood up and walked over to her. She stopped sharpening the knife and looked up at him, her eyes questioning. "Eisen," he began, his voice low and serious, "Croft won't stop. When he comes back with the marshal, he'll have the law on his side. He'll take the ranch. And because you stood with me, he will see you as part of it. It's not safe for you here." She watched him, her face calm. "I am not leaving," she said. It was not a question. It was a declaration. The simple finality of her words broke something loose in him. "Then we have to fight him another way, not with guns, with paper." He took a deep breath. In this territory, a man's property is his own. But a wife has dower rights. And an Apache wife, her people have treaty rights. Complicated ones a federal marshal from back east wouldn't want to get tangled up in. It would tie Croft up in the courts for years. It would make this piece of land more trouble than it's worth to him. He let the words hang in the air. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes. He had to make it plain. This could not be a trap. It had to be a choice. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "It would be a partnership, a legal shield. Nothing more, unless you chose for it to be. It would be your choice, always. But it would give us a chance to hold this place, to hold it together." He had laid his heart bare. It was not a declaration of love, but of something deeper, something forged in shared work and quiet understanding. It was an admission that his solitude was no longer enough. Eisen stared at him for a long, silent minute. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside. He could see the calculations in her eyes, the weighing of risks and possibilities. She was not a romantic girl. She was a survivor, just like him. She was looking for the truth of his offer. Finally, she stood up, so they were face to face. She was shorter than him, but she had a presence that made her seem his equal in every way. She reached out and lightly touched the cougar scar on his forearm with her fingertips. Then she held up her own hand, showing him the silvery scar there. "Things that are mended," she said softly, "are sometimes stronger where they were broken." She met his gaze. "Hard tea," she said. It was a word in her own language. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means yes," she said, "and it means it is a good path." 2 days later, they rode out before dawn, heading not for Wilcox, where Judge Hemmings and Marshal Tibbs held court, but west, on a 2-day ride to the next county seat, a town called Redemption. The circuit judge there, a man named Isaac Parker, was known to be a hard but fair man, immune to the influence of money. They were married in a dusty office that smelled of old paper and stale tobacco. Judge Parker looked at them over his spectacles, a white man scarred by the land, and an Apache woman whose face held a history he could only guess at. He asked the required questions. Elias answered in a clear voice. Eisen answered with her one word of English. Yes. The judge stamped the marriage certificate with a heavy seal. Mr. Thorne? Mrs. Thorne? He said, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, in his old eyes. The law is a strange instrument, but today I believe it has been put to good use. Good luck to you both. He was their neutral verifier. The document in Elias's hand was not just a piece of paper. It was a shield. It was a declaration. It was a beginning. They rode back to the ranch, not as two separate people, but as a legal fact. Something had shifted between them. The proposal had been one of practicality, but the act itself felt sacred. They were tied together now, their fates intertwined. The silence on the ride home was different again. It was the silence of a shared future, of a question asked and answered. They arrived back at the cabin as the sun was setting. Elias unsaddled the horses, while Eisen went inside to start the fire. When he walked in, the cabin was warm. A stew was already on the stove, and the light from the fire made the small room feel like a sanctuary. He looked at her, and she looked at him. For the first time, he saw her smile. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed her face. It lit her up from the inside, and in that moment, he knew that his careful, simplified life was over. He was part of something bigger now, and he would defend it with everything he had. They did not have to wait long. 3 days after their return, Silas Croft came back. This time, he brought Marshal Tibbs and 4 hired men. They rode up to the cabin with an air of grim finality. The marshal, a man with a weak chin and shifty eyes, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Thorne!" Croft bellowed. "It's over. The marshal has a warrant of seizure. You will vacate this property immediately." Elias stepped out onto the porch. He was not holding a rifle. He was holding a piece of paper. Eisen came and stood beside him, her hands empty, her posture calm and unafraid. "Marshal," Elias said, his voice ringing with a confidence that surprised even himself. "I believe you're operating under a misapprehension." He held out the marriage certificate. "This ranch is no longer solely my property. It is co-owned by my wife, Eisen Thorne." The marshal took the paper and squinted at it. His face went pale. He looked from the official seal of Judge Parker to Eisen's unyielding face. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A trick. It means nothing." "On the contrary," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tension. "It means everything. My wife is Chiricahua Apache. Her people have treaty rights in this territory, recognized by the federal government. Any claim you think you have against my property is now a claim against hers. And I suspect the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the United States Army would be very interested to hear about a territorial marshal seizing treaty-protected land on behalf of a private citizen based on a fraudulent survey. It would create a complication." The word hung in the air. The hired men exchanged nervous glances. Marshal Tibbs looked like he was going to be sick. He was a small-town official. The idea of getting caught between a wealthy baron, the U.S. Army, and Apache treaty law was his worst nightmare. "Is this true?" the marshal asked Croft, his voice trembling slightly. "It's a sham," Croft snarled, but his bluster was gone. He saw the trap closing around him. He had been checkmated. The marshal crumpled the warrant in his hand. "My authority here extends to civilian property disputes, Croft. This," he gestured vaguely at Eisen and the certificate. "This is a federal matter. My hands are tied. This is over. He turned his horse and rode away without another word. The hired men, sensing the shift in power, followed him quickly, eager to be gone. Silas Croft was left alone, his face a mask of purple rage. He stared at Elias and Eisen, his eyes burning with hatred. He had been beaten, not by force, but by foresight, by a careful man and a strong woman. "This isn't over, Thorn," he hissed. "Yes, it is," Elias said quietly. He turned his back on Croft, and with Eisen at his side, walked back into the cabin and closed the door. They heard the furious sound of a horse galloping away, and then there was only the sound of the wind. The winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted, feeding the creek until it ran high and fast. The world turned green again. The threat from Croft faded, becoming a bad memory. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm of 2 heartbeats instead of 1. Eisen took over the fallow garden plot. She worked the soil, her hands gentle and sure. She planted the seeds for corn and squash and beans that Elias had saved, and alongside them, she planted the herbs and roots of her own people, mingling the 2 traditions in the dark, rich earth. They worked the cattle, mended the fences, and rebuilt the section of the barn that had been damaged by the heavy snows. They were a team, moving in the easy, unspoken sync of people who know each other's minds. He taught her more English, and she taught him words in her language, the names for the mountains, the hawk, the sky. The name she had for him was Nantan bin Nada Go-He, the friend who stands his ground. The house changed. Woven leather patterns decorated the mantelpiece. The smell of her cooking filled the rooms. Her low, humming songs became the soundtrack to his days. The crushing silence he had lived with for 9 years was gone, replaced by a quiet that was alive and full and warm. He learned the story of her scar. It was from a fall, as a child, onto a sharp piece of slate by a river, a simple accident. But to him, it remained a match for his own, a symbol of their shared survival. One evening in late spring, they were sitting on the porch, watching the last light leave the sky. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. "Nantan's letter," Elias said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The debt. It wasn't about the money for the doctor, was it?" Eisen was silent for a moment, watching the first stars appear. "No," she said. "He saw that you were alone. And I was alone. He believed that things that go together belong together. He hoped this land would be a shelter for me, and that I might be a shelter for you." The second reason, the one that had been hidden between the lines of the letter. It wasn't a debt of money Nantan was trying to repay. It was a debt of hope, paid forward to the 2 people he cared about most. Elias looked at her, at the proud, strong woman who had faced down his enemies and brought his house and his heart back to life. He thought of the desperate, practical proposal he had made in the dead of winter. It had been a shield, but somewhere along the way, it had become the truth. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his. His hand was rough and calloused from work. Hers was slender, but just as strong. His scarred, hers scarred. Mended, stronger where they were broken. He looked out at the land, his land, their land. He saw the sturdy cabin, the greening garden, the creek that remembered everything. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his friend Nantan had been right. The truest shelter was not a roof over your head. It was the reason you had to come in from the storm. And he was finally home.